Have our next event. Before that, I should let you know, several people have asked us for the slides. Hello, everybody. Please take your seats. Hello. Please take your seat. I've been asked if the slides will be available, and if you email Karen Spitzer at karen.spitzer, that's Spitzer, at the International Center for Finance, she will send you the slides for, I think most of them are available. There may be one or two speakers that did not want their slides distributed to the public, but I think they're generally going to be available. Yale.edu, yes. Karen.Spitzer at Yale.edu. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Julie and Cherie. Cherie is going to, you've already heard her introduction. She's going to interview Julie. Julie's a survivor of Maury's last night, and none the worse for wear. So congratulations, Julie, on your first cup. Okay.
Thank you.
Join me in welcoming.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. We have Kevin to thank for these dinners and the endless jugs of blue stuff that he's making us drink. Anyway.
I thought it was green. Okay, good. It started to be.
I thought it was Yale blue, but okay. Anyway, so we are so happy, I'm so happy and so pleased to introduce Julie Skolnicki, a Senior Managing Director of Greystar's University Partnership and Campus Development, Acquisition, and Long-Term Partnerships for Greystar. And you have her bio in front of you, and she has done so much to integrate both architecture into public-private partnerships as well as investments into the space. And we'd like to hear more about what they're doing. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Julie Skolnicki and ask her to provide an overview of Greystar and its business. So Julie, tell us a little bit more about your firm and what you do.
Yeah, happily.
Please.
Is there, I think I left the clicker.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Yes, since it's a fireside chat, we'll sit.
We'll sit. Yeah.
So thanks for having me here today, and the dinner was lovely. Usually when I'm speaking, I always tell everyone my favorite place to be is on a campus, so it's always great to actually be on a campus when we're speaking. And the walk from the hotel to here was stunning, and you know, college campuses have so much to offer, and I think we're seeing just so much development happening in and around campuses, and that's been really exciting for me. I got my start about 25 years ago as a campus planner, and that really evolved into development and now investment. And I think there's, you know, just great opportunity around the edge of campus. Am I hitting the right thing?
Well, yeah, I think you just click it. We're working on it. Okay. No, I mean, it's just sort of an introduction of who Greystar is. I think some of you may know Greystar as a multifamily development firm, but it was, I've been following the firm for a number of years now, initially as an investor, and I was really pleased to see Greystar going into the student housing space. And in particular, and we'll talk a little bit more about that after you provide kind of an overview of what the firm does and its scope and breadth in the in the investment markets today.
Yeah, absolutely. So Greystar, many of you may know, is a global company. I think we have some 65 offices globally, and we manage almost 1 million units now of multifamily housing. We've expanded more recently.
Are the slides available yet? Are we still working on it? Okay. If you've ever been to Charleston, South Carolina, it's a very, it's a small town with a very unassuming kind of office space. But I was really surprised to know and to see what your outreach has been and how significantly big your business has gotten. since its inception.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think, Charleston as a headquarters sets a certain type of tone into how we invest and how we think about creating great space. And I think some of the other folks talked about it before. We really look and invest in demographically driven spaces, right? So that started with multifamily housing. We added student housing in 2013 with an acquisition of a portfolio in the UK. And then I came to Greystar through the take private of EDR, a publicly traded REIT, in 2018. And so that really grew our presence in the US. We now have about 140,000 student beds globally, about 40,000 in Europe, about 100,000 here in the US, although KKR just acquired a piece of that recently, so we just got a little smaller, but we continue to grow. And much of that is through development. And so, most of my world is the on-campus development space, but I think because we see the big picture, we can do so much more, right? We do have an industrial group. We have life science. We heard about that a little bit earlier, based in Boston. And so as we talk with campuses, many times we can look at it more as creating an entire community, right? We can take on innovation districts that include workforce housing, student housing, and life science. And we can work across the spectrum from top of market, off-campus student housing, as well as workforce housing focused on research.
All with the core and the base of multifamily, which was your bread and butter initially. Yep. Do you want to try that now and see if that works?
Sure.
Is it still loading? We should have checked this before.
Maybe I didn't get the right SEC approvals before I sent the deck.
Okay. How's it going, Karen? All right. It's all right. So, can you please just check into that and let us know when it's working? And we can start with a conversation on. So I'm gonna start and hit it up a little bit hard for you, if you don't mind. So according to a PBS or 60-minute article, I'm not quite sure where I saw it. I was cooking dinner one night, so I had to take notes. But I saw an article that was dealing with affordability in student housing. And in the article, they stated that 1 in 2 students experience housing insecurity, 1 in 12 experience homelessness. And they featured UC Austin, where Rish is from, I wish he's here, where room and board now exceeds in-state tuition. Julie, if you could talk to us a little bit about how your business in particular, financing student housing using public-private partnerships, tries to address, this gap, so to speak, a financing gap, and how important affordability is across the higher education landscape.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important topic, and one that we're hearing more and more recently. It was probably 5 years ago when we heard those stats at the UC system and at Berkeley. We're now hearing it at UT Austin, the stats that you just rattled off. And I think it's because the campuses have not built their infrastructure. And so you have the off-campus responding, and responding in the way they know how, which is to build top of the market, new housing. And, it's incredible. We do both at Greystar. We have on and off campus housing. So we actually delivered 2,400 beds off campus at UT Austin last year. But the on campus has really stagnated. The campus, as they've grown about 10% in the last 5 years.
And in some cases, because of obsolescence, they've actually had to tear down buildings from what my undergrad.
Yeah, nothing I lived in exists anymore. But in general, at UT, for example, they're a Research One flagship institution in the Power 5, now 4. So this is a robust campus, but they are not considered a residential campus. Carnegie classifies a residential campus as anyone that houses more than 25% of their students. UT only houses 14%.
Wow.
And so this discussion, is sort of looking back, and the markets where we've seen a run up in the off-campus rates year over year have been campuses just like that.
Wow.
So Auburn is suffering a similar situation where they're housing less than 20% of their students on campus. The campuses that have been able to moderate that
Works now, I think.
are those that have built on campus, because on campus tends to stay at about a 3% rental rate increase year over year,
Interesting.
which is very different, right, than the off-campus market.
Quite. And some of the multifamilies that are growing outside of campuses are beginning to look like Class A development, and I just don't understand how students can, the expectations of students living there after they leave is also kind of surprising. But anyway,
and
more.
And I'll go to the slides, but I mean, I think that the conversation about UT and other campuses like that impacts multifamily as well as student. When you talk about campuses like Austin, where there was a run-up on multifamily in the double-digit rental rate increases, that was impacting the amount of supply that there was for students. So it was pushing them tighter into campus, and it was pushing the rental rates up.
I see.
So we see kind of public-private partnerships as a key way to structure deals, work with university in order to maintain affordability.
And how did that work first? And you can go directly to your slides if you'd like. Did they come to you, or did you come up with this idea and say, by the way, you have an issue, we could address this?
Well, similar to Rich, I came up with the P3, I think 15 years ago. People were like, should it be P cubed or, but we were talking about it on the advisory side for a while. And coming out of the great financial crisis, universities were no longer being funded in the same way from the state. And they had to really look at all of their assets, and real estate was one of them, and say, what of these are revenue generating? And so the revenue generating space, housing, in some cases recreation, and student centers, they began looking at as how can we really update, compete, and they're doing it through student fees or by outsourcing. So that really became the growth of the market. University of Kentucky was kind of the first large-scale P3. We started in 2011, and we opened our first project in 2013. And so that really started what campuses are looking at is how can we address deferred maintenance and build new housing and compete for students.
Interesting.
So this is the slide I was going to talk about to explain Greystar. So I think I hit on most of this, but I'm not going to be able to answer questions about life science or industrial or hospitality, but that blue box is sort of my sweet spot. On-campus partnerships, we've been on 60 campuses. We've developed about 50,000 beds. And so that's kind of the piece we'll talk about today. We do have more student housing off campus. I work directly with that team on the development side, but it's a different investment thesis, in some cases different investors, and a different approach.
Great.
As I mentioned before, we do have a global reach, and it was fun to see some of the same topics come out from Paula. We absolutely...
You should focus on the cities, Shanghai with, instead of the dark blue, you should look at the smaller light blue, because
ones.
that actually talks about this dispersion better.
Absolutely. So
But I'm impressed anyway.
There you go. So this is where we are. I like to take lessons from the different developments globally, but each market, just like multifamily, is so different, right? I really focus on the US and Canada. Canada has a lot of the same kind of growth trajectory that we've seen here in the US, and our model in Europe is a little bit different. They don't tend to be as university-centric. Many of our housing globally might relate to multiple campuses. Whereas if you're building here in the US, if you're building in Tuscaloosa, you're housing University of Alabama students. There really is no one else. So understanding that market's really important. So this piece was really sort of the why. Why is there so much demand for student housing? And like most things at Greystar, we look at it from a demographic driver perspective. You will hear higher ed talk about the enrollment cliff, but the reality is that the college-age student demographic is going to remain consistent. So that 18 to 24-year-old will remain consistent until about 2040. So we'll continue to have the same group of students. And what we're seeing is there is a higher percentage of college-age students that are going to higher ed. There's always pocket markets where you're seeing a drop-off. We have seen some drop-off in male attendance at colleges and some sub-markets. But overall, people really see that sort of compelling return on investment. We saw it during COVID. Salaries were much higher and continue to outpace at a pretty significant clip for those that went to higher ed and specifically four-year colleges. So that continues. The other piece is, despite what we heard about UT, actually what's interesting is you said room and board is more expensive than tuition. It's because most campuses have had some sort of tuition stabilization.
I see.
Or freeze, right? So in the state of Ohio, they froze tuition for a while. Different states sort of have tempered that, and they manage tuition at a time when the market is responding to demand and increasing the actual cost of housing.
You know, you bring up a really interesting point. You're talking about a 15-year runway for development of student housing because of extreme demand. And I don't know about you all, but if you've been through the GFC, where everybody stopped developing, that's the reason we have an affordable housing crisis today. So for those with enough conviction and forethought, perhaps student housing development is something that has a growth, factor to it.
Yeah, the entire industry really came about in the past 15 to 20 years, and that was all based on millennials.
I never heard of it before.
Yeah, I mean,
10 years ago. Anyway.
Because we all lived in the shadow market. So if you lived in a house, a group house, when you were in college, then you were the shadow market. So the other shift we've seen since COVID that is having an impact on really overall affordability has been that there is a shift at where students are going to college. There's been a focus on really, as I mentioned before, the return on investment. So we're seeing an increase in applications, of course, at schools like this, but also at R1 flagship institutions. There's really this looking at, can I get a research degree? What will my job be when I get out of college? And so you're seeing some of that shift away from schools that might be a little smaller, small privates, and a shift more towards who is a research institution, where can I get the best degree, and where can I have the best college experience? The question during COVID was, will everyone just take classes online? The answer was no. Applications went up to the University of Texas, right, where you can go watch great football, and to campuses that have a good student life, right? So whether that's the athletic program or the overall quality of life at places like this that have 2, 3, 4-year live-on requirements.
So you kind of allude to supply-demand imbalances or asymmetries. What does that look like across our country? And how does that differ from region to region and from public versus private colleges? And I think you play in all the worlds, in all those areas, right?
5 years ago, private institutions were not as interested in P3. They tended to do it on their own, but we have seen an increase of private universities looking at public-private partnerships. I mean, I think that the supply-demand gap really has to do, one, with the run-up on millennials, but two, the last time there was a major housing boom was sort of the post-war boom. So if you look at on-campus stock, about 25% of all student housing stock is on campus, and half of that is 30 years or older. Much of it, when we're on campuses, is from the 1970s and has just significant deferred maintenance that is burdening the university's debt capacity and overall financials. So you see, there's an opportunity to really repurpose, renovate the on-campus, but there's also 50% of student housing is still what I talked about before, that sort of shadow market, students living in houses. Many of those houses are struggling and are not managed well. You hear horrible stories about fires and things like that. And so there's still an incredible opportunity to sort of reposition and develop both on and off campus.
Great.
You will find more, there's more housing in the Midwest, right? In the Big Ten and the Northeast. And so I think our focus there is on replacement or renovate, whereas where you have the growth markets of Florida, the Carolinas, Texas, and California, just need to build. They just need more.
Right. And so I imagine there's a lot of opportunity to meet these demands. I wonder if you could get into a little bit of what kind of deal structures that you have for many of us who don't have experience with public-private partnerships. I think some with affordable housing more often, but I think your ideas of what public financing versus private financing differs a little bit. If you could walk us through that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Please.
one more slide
Oh,
I have in
please,
between, right? Just on sort of the why P3, like why are universities looking at this? And as I said 10 years ago, Kentucky was one of the first jumping in the mix, and then you've got Arizona State and a few others. But others were sort of holding it in-house, saying they could do it, universities could do it themselves. But in general, universities, when they do housing, they might build 600 beds at a time. We're now seeing major institutions. UVA has an RFP out on the street right now for over 2,000 beds. We're seeing the need for scale and speed, and that's the reason they're looking at P3, is the development expertise, the investment, as well as the overall operations. And so with that, we look at these factors as how do we drive affordability, and which components, I have here sort of credit enhancements. Credit enhancements are the different things universities can bring to the table to make sure that it's investable and to make sure that it can last long term.
And these are university funds when you talk about credit enhancements, right?
It depends. It depends. So
Does it expect a return?
There are, wrong button. There are different approaches, right? So some institutions say, you know what, Julie, our cost of capital is like 2%. We don't need your money. We're going to go do it ourselves. But what we do struggle with is managing cost. When you're at a university and you have a dean that says, I want this, and you have a VP that wants something else, we find that buildings developed directly on campus might be 60, 50% efficient, whereas the outside development off campus would be 80% efficient. So we tend to work within that space, use our development expertise, and really sort of drive the development side. And those could be university financed. University of South Carolina, we opened 1,800 beds last year. University got great financing, and they said, you just handle the development, we'll handle the financing, and then we joint operations. And that was, it's on their balance sheet.
So it's more like a JV.
Yep, yeah. Okay. And in some of these, it evolves over time, right? You originally present, and I know I talked to some folks earlier, we may look at all three of these scenarios, whether we're using university financing, third-party 501c3 financing, or equity, and the university then decides. And we can run that trap up until probably 6 months before closing to then pivot and finance in any range of ways.
Do you ever reach a point where you actually develop and then do a turnkey kind of?
Develop and sort of give back?
And give it back to the
just
university?
Strictly without
So
management.
you're just working for development fees, for instance?
Yeah, there's certainly some institutions that are looking at that. I mean, the management is one piece of it, long-term operations, but other schools say, you know what, we have this, or we're required to have union labor anyway, so we're going to use our own staff to manage it. On the far right is the equity model. It's something you all are very used to, right? It's, might put 45 to 50, maybe 60% leverage on it, but it's traditional equity. And the goal there, many institutions want it to be more arm's distance. We see more apartment style units being developed in this manner, something that might be upper division housing, where they say, we have the land, you guys take care of everything. You can market to our students, but we don't really want to be involved. We would like to pledge our land, right, for market ground rent, but they also can look at their land at a lower basis in order to drive affordability.
Interesting. So with that all, what gaps, if any, still exist in financing today that you've seen?
Yeah, I
what
think
is
it's
needed?
Yeah, it's always the balance between affordability and where construction and financing costs are right now. So the gaps in financing, folks are just getting a lot more creative about how we can put this together. We have some campuses that are saying they'll put in 30% of the equity, and that starts to look a little bit different. We have some campuses that really want to go with a 501c3 model, and that's where we go out to the market. It's a private, unaffiliated 501c3 that owns the project, and then you take it out with tax-exempt bonds, and your goal is 1.2 debt coverage ratio. And if we can't cover that, then you can look at B bonds, subordinate bonds, and other ways to close the gap. But the best thing a university can do in order to drive affordability, if in fact that's their goal, which most are, is land. And and real estate tax.
Well, it seems to make, some sense that the university would want to provide some level of affordable housing because it really drives more business towards them. I mean, you don't want an empty campus. So, pivoting to a different, to the bricks and mortar, what type of development designs are needed in this space?
It's the full range. I mean, I love being on campuses, and it's fun that we get to do sort of traditional residence halls these days. The project on the far right is with a small college, Merrimack, outside of Boston, and they had seen pretty significant growth, and they could not keep up with it. But they wanted it to be targeted on first-year students. So bringing in first years, recruitment and retention is incredibly important. And so, we did a traditional bath down the hall. And I haven't done one of those in a while, right? Because people said, oh, students want apartments, they want single rooms. Well, this is about what's the appropriate project and scheme for the university and for student life. So that's a great opportunity where we get to work with designers on, really knitting into the campus and adding dining and other components to really weave it all together, which is different than UC Law, which is really focused on affordable housing, not capital A affordable, attainable housing for grad students in a market that when we started was incredibly hot. It has since gotten a little quieter, but the goal being, how do you develop in a very tough market, provide classroom space as well as housing, and do it in a way that's most affordable.
Very interesting. I would never have expected to see a mid to high rise at the University of Hawaii, of all places, I guess.
Well, you can come see it. It'll open next summer.
Or hear about gang showers and, bathrooms at the end of the hall.
They're now spa bathrooms.
Oh, okay, okay. That makes it so much better.
Yes.
So I see a variety of different types of constructions here, and your scope is global. So tell us, is there anything distinct or unique to your products as they vary by country or state or region?
Yeah, I will say...
In general?
Yeah, in general. I will point out that the one that looks a little bit older is, in fact, an acquisition at University of Washington. That is not a new build, but was a repositioning. And so in terms of what's different globally, in Europe and specifically in London, we have a more high-rise product that is focused on a range of colleges, right? So there might be 60 different universities in one of our buildings, and it's very brand-centric in Europe because you are pulling from multiple institutions. Many times we're housing up to 80% international students, so brand recognition travels with you across.
I did notice that in DC, actually. I was walking near the World Bank, and there was a university I've never heard of before, and a lot of English as a second language type students, mostly from the Middle East, and they were and they all looked like they were fairly well off. So that was
fascinating, and we have not seen it translate in the U.S. significantly, but in markets like DC and in New York and San Francisco can have that same component, but the investment thesis hasn't truly proven out yet. But in Europe, it is a big piece of the way we look at it. And we have kind of more of a mid-tier product that is actually, if you think about DC, like on the Beltway, but in London, it's, the outer zones, and that's a different product.
And you can see that because UCL and LSE in London, for instance, are almost cheek and jowl, so I can imagine that they would share very similar common spaces. Yeah. So what is your brand called in London?
So we have Chapter, which is our kind of inner circle brand, if you will, and then Canvas is sort of our outer circle. And so it's interesting there that brand is so incredibly important. We've constantly talked about whether brand is important in the U.S.
Interesting.
And it can be, but it's more if you're a parent and say, okay, my child lives in a union property at Alabama, then the union property if you have another child that's going to ASU.
So that's a preview of coming attractions here in the U.S.
There you go.
And so Are there any, so that's really a great way to sort of take a look at the student housing as a specific real estate sector or subsector. And, you're financing as, I know we've barely scratched the surface, but is there anything that the audience would like to know a little bit more about or have Julie expand on? Equity and debt structures. Please tell us about it. And tell me a little bit about how University of Kentucky found you, how you all found each other at the inception of this business.
Yeah, University of Kentucky had been looking into the P3 concept for a while, but it didn't really happen until President Capilouto came on board. And he was recruited to come to the University of Kentucky, and he toured, and he said, this is not representative of the state of Kentucky. If we are going to be a flagship institution, this does not represent us. So they had, at the time, once again, this is 2011, a $1 billion capital plan for classrooms, student uses, rec center, new union, student housing. And they said, we can't do this all on our own. So we want something. They, at that point in time, wanted 100% equity off balance sheet. And they came to us. We ultimately built about $500 million worth of student housing. We just broke ground on another project that'll take us up to 7,000 beds. But by doing that, they now have what's probably worth more like 800,000, if not more, $1 million projects, and they got $350 million of deferred maintenance off of their books. So that swing,
so the initial return is the number of units, and then in addition to that, there's the financial advantages of leveraging this.
The financial advantage of getting the deferred maintenance off their books, which is an incredible issue for most campuses. And the other piece was enrollment. They actually ended up getting credit positive because they've been able to grow. At a time when they were really flat, you sort of had, other schools in Kentucky competing for their students. They then could use their capital to invest in their classrooms. Yeah. So the amount of, they've basically spent another $2 billion reinvesting in their classroom space, which has helped their recruitment and their retention, and investing in their hospital as well.
Really interesting. And it looks like, the range of scopes of different types of structures that you have really extends to smaller apartment units, multi-units, to larger mid-scale and high-rise.
Right. It's like all real estate, right? It's local. So, Cornell, they had some significant land. They wanted to focus on grad students. We are seeing a lot more of that sort of affordability, thinking about workforce housing as your graduate students, your research, your young faculty and staff, how do you house them? And so by looking at land and figuring out how to monetize that and how do you help grow your programs has been the focus there. And that was the focus for both Penn and Cornell, was to provide new housing to recruit and retain grad students, but at below market. So they're coming in about 20% below the rent check of comps.
Interesting. And I imagine, as a final question here before I open it up to the audience, does Greystar, can Greystar leverage these types of housing products to postgraduate? I mean, are you able to develop very similar project to attract the same students as they graduate?
Yeah, I mean, it does become that sort of continuum and that flywheel, right? If you live in a Greystar property and then you move off campus as a grad student or young professional, that's what's great about some of these markets I was talking about, like Austin and Columbus, Ohio, and places where you stay, right? So you sort of graduate from the student housing into a multifamily property, and then onto our active adult.
Yeah, impressive. Well, thank you so much for walking us through there. Are there any other slides that we've missed?
Yeah, I think
on this? Okay. I'm going to open it up to the audience, please, and if you have any questions about Greystar or Julie's particular multifaceted skill sets, how she got to where she is, please.
Hi. A question about what Cherie opens with, the lower income students, those who safely housed or rent housing. I assume that all these universities have diversity goals so that the students get to know other people different from themselves. Do the universities give an assist so that the lower income students can also live in these properties along with those who are paying full freight? Does the university make that decision so you don't have to?
Absolutely. I mean, any of our, especially first and second year housing. So let's say for a campus that, Kentucky, for example, we own and manage about 90% of their housing. They don't want it to look any different than Kentucky housing. Everyone has the same shirt on. It all goes through the same leasing office, and they can then apply their scholarships towards it. So it all runs through the same system. In many of these cases, we are actually benchmarking our rate to the university. So we're working with them, and once again, they're providing land basis that's very valuable. In some cases, they're supporting a real estate tax exemption. And so with that, Kentucky Phase 1 was 5% higher than their product that was 40 years older. So we've benchmarked it to that so that it's not seen as the have and have-nots. We also work on campuses that have sort of a flat, all freshmen play this rate, and we fit into that system.
Okay. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on each university's sort of auditor. We sit down with them, and there are different levers that sometimes they want to be pulled to make sure that the university wouldn't have to step in. And so that becomes part of the conversation as well. But there's a number of factors that they look at in that component. So really, I'm just reporting on what I've been told.
Yeah. Yeah.
A quick final question, I promise. So, Julie, if the universities are offering essentially free financing or the land donated to the project, then the only practical limit on the number of student housing units you can build is how many of the student population can afford whatever the prevailing housing rate is, right? And so that there's a way to pre-estimate the market on any university campus based upon a demographic profile of the students that attend that university, right? Generally?
Generally, yeah.
And is that how you pick your new targets? You go to university and say, maybe you didn't know, but we can do this thing for you.
Yeah, I mean, we try to talk to as many campuses as we can. And it really, you want to look at who has deferred maintenance, right? Who has growth? And where do we think we can provide that? And, there's more campuses than we can build on, but they have to make that decision for themselves. And many campuses still build on their own.
In as much as it's demographically
Yeah.
driven, though, it's really, it could be your area to choose, so to speak.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's all strategic plan driven,
Yeah.
right, as well. Like, where do they want to invest? And I think campuses more and more, how they treat student life facilities is representative of the students they want to attract. And so it's a key part of students' decision making on where they go.
Absolutely. You got to live somewhere.
There you go.
Good. Thank you so much, Julie. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Cherie and Julie. Let's move on to the next panel.